Good day to you. You know, we all look in the mirror, and it's not always easy, is it? I mean, we see the flaws. We want to look away. We want to think that we look different than what we're actually seeing in the mirror. Of course, there are good qualities. Being able to see yourself is important to self-concept, but my point here is that when we look at the mirror, it's not necessarily easy because it automatically engages us in self-reflection. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do today, but on a much grander scale. I'm going to be asking you to take on some of the very tenets of what it means to be a U.S. person. I phrase it that way because I'm not really talking about citizenship today as in U.S. citizenship. I'm not really talking about being an American because Canadians are Americans and some Mexicans consider themselves to be Americans too. Just think about that as a launching pad for our talk today, because I'm going to be on the back of this book chapter, which is talking about the U.S. as a behemoth. If you don't know that word, I'm sure you have thought of it as a scary kind of word before. A behemoth on the world stage. We're talking about the United States today, and we're going to reflect upon what it means to be in this country and using a media system that we have easy access to, building on the last chapter. And it's not always pretty. It's not always pretty what we're going to take a look at, but that's kind of the point, right? This is a critical book. It says that it's going to be critical in its approach to media systems, and that is certainly the case here. Before we get into that, though, I do believe a pep talk is in order. I do want to say that some of you are really excelling at the writing for the class now. On those discussion posts, whether they're RSC posts or country media posts, you're doing a great job. You're really finding a way within that 200 words to extract the readings and demonstrate that you know what you're writing about, and that what you've done is you've read the material, and now you have an advanced level of thinking. An advanced level of thinking that shows up in your discussion posts. And those of you who are not doing well in discussion posts, whether it's turning them in late, with not much time before the deadline is due to proofread your work and catch those writing errors that you really get in the way of your ideas coming out in just 200 words, or whether you're not pulling from the reading the material in a substantive way that shows that you've read the chapter and it has elevated your thinking. It's advanced it. If you haven't read the material, it just shows up in your writing. It's just because you don't have that advanced level of thinking. So this is a good time for you to reset yourself if you're falling back a bit in the class, and rededicate yourself to those discussion posts, because I tell you what, when I get a good one or a good several, it's really amazing to me. It's amazing the insights that students have, and it's part of the collaborative learning process that goes on between myself as a professor and the students as well. So keep it up, and also think about the source. Think about the source that you're getting your research from in terms of today's reading, actually, because one of the things that we're learning about is research, so to speak, often has a financial backer to it, right? And you may be grabbing journal articles. Oh, this sounds good. The blah, blah, blah media research journal. That sounds good for this post. And I bet you don't have any idea whether it's funded or not. And if it is, who's funding it? Is it a company? Is it a government agency? Is it a branch of the military? Those items are all discussed in today's chapter. So let's get into it. This is all about the reach of the U.S. around the world through our media systems. Thinking of media as kind of an ambassador for our country, right? When people are not able to travel to the United States, they're living in Afghanistan maybe even, or places that we more commonly associate our foreign travel with, like Europe, England, for example, or France, or Mexico. Think of what those people are gaining impression-wise about the United States when they are accessing our media products, which are going all over the world. We're the biggest media producer all over the world. We're a behemoth. And this book makes the claim, this chapter, that we are imperial in the way that we use our media. Now, you may not know that term. It's kind of an old term. It means exerting your influence over another country without them agreeing to it, or without them being aware of it. And that's more where media lie. People are not as aware. If people are starting to eat fast food in other countries, food that only fits in cup holders of cars, as opposed to traditional dishes like rice and beans, or fruits in the morning, yeah, they're losing not just a way of eating, they're losing a piece of culture due to imperialism. And it may be sneaking up on them because they're having the feeling that they don't belong with the rest of the world, that they don't fit in, that they're not modern enough if they're not doing those kind of things. So this chapter gets into that, and it talks really about three areas of media. And it's a little bit fragmented. To me, for this chapter, I gotta stab at the material to read it. I gotta just keep going back to it, not necessarily read it through as a story, but go back, and because it's in chunks. And so the first chunk that it's talking about is cinema. And that's all about how our film industry is all over the world. Oddly enough, missing from this chapter is the fact that the largest film industry in the world is not actually Hollywood. It's actually Bollywood in India, which produces up to, I think it's 1,000 films a year. Yeah, so that's another subject. But the American film industry, that is a force to be reckoned with, I gotta say. I've been in a lot of countries. I'm amazed at the American films that I see every time I go somewhere. I can watch an American film. I can watch several when I'm in Mexico. I can watch them in Spanish, or I can watch them with English subtitles. I've seen films in really small towns in Europe. And of course, there's American films all over television in other countries as well. So the expanse of Hollywood and its ideals is really, really amazing. And what you may not know, though, is that Hollywood is not just producing content independent of any kind of ideological influence. No. There's the State Department. There's the U.S. Information Service. There's the Department of Commerce. All those agencies talked about in this chapter that have had direct financial partnerships with Hollywood to produce films like Let's Kill a Jap Today. Think about that. Let's Kill a Jap Today. Do you know about that? Yeah, short trailers that used to air in the 1940s in American film theaters before the feature film would air. You'd have a trailer, Kill a Jap Today. We were at war with the Japanese. But let's not ignore the fact that that's a really extreme, inhumane statement. It's talking about all Japanese, and it was being aired in movie theaters with these subsidies coming from the U.S. government, particularly the U.S. military. So that chapter makes a lot of connections between financial connections and also power and control connections between government agencies, between military, between a lot of heavy-duty corporate institutional influences that have a vested interest in producing ways of seeing the world. I can remember a lot of the war films that were a part of my generation when I grew up in the 1970s. There were a ton of war films. You had a lot of people who had been in World War II and Vietnam and the Korean War. And so war films were very popular for that generation. And war films were always portraying the U.S. military as the valiant people going into battle, almost always I should say, going into battle with good-looking heroes like John Wayne, if you know that movie actor. And war films have gotten more realistic in recent times. Platoon, not that that's a recent film, different from the kind of film that I'm talking about. But my point here is the film as a medium is carrying an ideology because the content is influenced by the financial backers, in this case, our own institutions of government. And we need to be aware of that's going on. Part of why the U.S. is, or was, and still is, a behemoth of imperialism across the world. You have millions of people today salivating at Marvel films and then dressing up in their costumes for Halloween, or acting out those characters in school, or some other kind of exhibition that the film has had an impact on their way of thinking, their way of life. All right, so then the next chunk, to go to that now in the chapter, is the television side of things, which I've already briefly introduced. And television is all over the world too. When we talk about accessibility, as we did last time, I got to tell you, when you pick up the remote control for a television channel, if you know that word, in almost every European country, and you scroll through it, for lots of reasons, you're going to see a lot of American programs. You're going to see in Europe, you're going to see a lot of French programs. You see Italian programs. You're talking films, comedies, documentaries. Same on radio. Radio, you can listen to radio, not across the board because of the language differences and how important language is to song, but pretty regularly you can hear songs from other countries, even listening to pop radio. So there's a lot of that going on across the world. In terms of the U.S. television industry, you can count on a really popular show, let's say Big Bang Theory, typically rating in the top 10 in the U.S. market. You're going to be able to see that in France right now. You're going to be able to see recent editions. May not be the one that came out today that you get to see, but last season's really, really present. The U.S. is all over the world. And television is also carrying a lot of news. A lot of people get TV news and they use that as a way to try and understand what's happening in the world. And that again becomes problematic from an imperialistic standpoint for the United States, because much of the television news has a vested interest in portraying wars that we are involved in with a decidedly U.S. positivity. I can tell you it was a real eye-opening experience. The Iraq War is talked about in this chapter, and I happened to be in Britain researching my book, Comparing Media from Around the World, when the U.S.-Iraq War was launched. And I was flipping back and forth between, trying to stay ahead of this lawnmower, between BBC channels and American channels. I'm just going to let them pass. All right, I apologize for that. I didn't pause, so it could be part of the viewing experience, since we're talking about television. So I watched two very different versions of the war, is basically what I was saying. I watched the BBC version, which showed real human toil. It showed houses being wrecked, it showed people crying, it showed what looked like innocent families not knowing what was happening to them. Then I saw the American coverage on CNN, and it was all like a fireworks show on 4th of July. Explosions here, explosions there, generals being interviewed, footage of troops moving into action. Very, very different story. And that's part of the legacy of American media. That, by the way, is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons that we have the BBC World Service at WESS Radio, the BBC World Service from the British Broadcasting Corporation, which when many people listen to it, they say, wow, I learned a lot more about my own country by listening to the BBC World Service. So that fits into people who are portrayed on television, which is the next part of what I want to talk about. And there's the people who are interviewed on American television are very typically established people. They're professionals, they're celebrities, politicians, even people like myself, professors. They are not the average ordinary citizen. So therefore, you do not have a very realistic view of the cross-section of society. That is how people really exist. Excuse me while I put my bottle cap back on. So in terms of this contributing to the behemoth that this book is arguing the United States has become, is just another way that we're sort of clubbing the rest of the world with ideals that don't really exist. All right, the third chunk of this chapter that I want to talk about, you'll have much more expertise than me in, and that is games. That is games, video gaming. Everybody's gaming today. Everybody knows a lot of versions, 2.0, 3.0 of games, seasons of games. My son's telling me that Fortnite is still the most popular. So gaming is also a U.S. world influence that's going on. And the companies like Kuma War that are mentioned. And in these video games, a lot of times war is actually funded in a way to be portrayed to recruit people for the U.S. military. We need, according to the book, 80,000 people are needed to be recruited every year for the U.S. military to be viable. So, U.S. military, again, in keeping with the theme of this chapter, is involved in financing. The Pentagon has worked closely in financing Atari games. One of the early ones, Battlezone, is a game that is, again, trying to portray the U.S. American military might. Team Orlando is a term that's used in this chapter. Team Orlando referring to the place in Florida where you have Disney, you have Lockheed Martin, a military armaments and aircraft manufacturing firm, which many of you won't even know about, receiving billions of dollars in U.S. government contracts. You have that in the same area as Disney and Orlando, and those three together collaborate to produce content that's going to be favorable to the U.S. military. And so it's not all one-sided. It's not all one-sided. You do have other countries, and particularly countries that are associated with pockets of terrorism, like Al-Qaeda, and they are playing these American-style video games, but they're playing them in opposite, with the Arab being the victor, as opposed to the Islamic terrorist being the person that's always the bad person in these games. But you get my point. I see that There's an imagery and an ideology that comes across in the content as being distributed around the world. Next, the book goes into producers and the role that they play in the global behemathism of the United States. And this section is short. The main essence is you have white men who are within the American ideology. So it's not just American ideology that's in the media content, it's white male content. And independent people are very rarely included in the mix just because of the financial and the control advantages that the others have. And actually what has been developed, this is very interesting to me, is known as a risk society. A risk society where we accept risk, it's part of the game. I saw a commercial on television, for example, yesterday. It was supposed to be a funny Geico commercials. Side commentary here, I don't find Geico commercials funny. I find them insulting because they think they've guessed what I'm going to find funny because it's absurd, and no, they haven't guessed it at all. And in this commercial, they're making fun of how easy it is to get renter's insurance, which is something that many students face today. We never had to face that when I was younger. Where does that come from? That's an invention. Renter's insurance, it's another kind of insurance like phone insurance and car insurance and many other insurances. It's all based on risk. So on the risk that one time you really, 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 really need it, when you drop your phone in the water, you can replace it. But what's it worth? All these hundreds, thousands of dollars, and the wonderment, if nothing ever happens, was that wasted money gone. It's kind of a risk economy. It's a risk society. We do that with lots of things. We do that with warranty agreements. So you want to think of them as well, just extending off that a little bit. So this is what has arisen in part because of the overall structure of producers being white males who want to hold on to that power structure, and they have found a formula of a risk society, which also keeps us driven to the media because we're afraid not to watch media to find out whether we're really at risk, if you know what I mean. Yeah, it's getting a little bit deep here, but that kind of brings us back to the security industry that we talked about earlier in the chapter. And then lastly, there's the item of blockbusters discussed in the chapter. And blockbusters, not explained all that much detail, but the idea is to try and break through in the global behemoth distribution system of media to get across as many cable TV channels as possible. You can kind of say that the President of the United States explores that at least at the level of social media with Twitter and also his television work. And you can find lots of other examples of that with the big global media conglomerates, Disney and that, but they are in search of the blockbuster. That's the point. They're in search of the really big hit. And blockbusters minimize character development. They minimize character development, so all we really get are stereotypes. I flew on a plane this summer and I watched the film Creed. And in that film Creed, you had, I forget his name, Apollo's son. I originally came into the Rocky films when I was younger. I remember Apollo, I don't remember his name. It was played by Michael P. Jordan. And he's fighting a guy who is obviously portrayed as a really ugly, I won't say stupid, but thuggish Russian. The Russian is always the bad guy in these films. The Russian is the person who we look at, and this particular character is steel-jawed, bigger than Michael P. Jordan, seemed to have less emotion, came from conditions where his father was more abusive, came from conditions in Russia where he hardly had any money. You get the picture, right? The Russian character not really deeply explored in this film, trying to make it a blockbuster. And again, hidden within that blockbuster is an ideology about Russians. So yeah, a little bit different of a video lecture today, challenging you on several fronts, not only as an American, if you want to think of yourself as that way, but as a person who now may be thinking that you've been somewhat trapped by your own ideology, and that's sort of the point of this chapter. Still, have a great day.